The idea of that generation, I think, was assimilation. There was this tension about when do you assimilate and when do you not? And that was something that my mom talked about a lot. What she wanted us to know was like, whether you think you are X, Y, or Z, how other people perceive you matters. And so why not then just be who you are?
Welcome to the Courage Curve, a space for women who are standing at the edge of a shift or already moving through one. I'm Parul. My life has been shaped by steady decisions, inner resilience, and the moments where I had to choose courage long before I had clarity. Each week, I will speak with women who simply didn't arrive at a breakthrough. They built it step by step. From the outside, the transformation can look instantaneous. But together we will uncover the real story, the pressure, the truth-telling, the small choices that create the inflection point that we call the courage curve. Let these conversations stay close to you as you move through your own curve with strength, honesty, and companionship. Welcome to the Courage Curve. Today's guest has spent her life studying and living the question of who gets to belong and at what cost. Dr. Tanya Saroj Bakhru is a social scientist, professor, and author whose work spans decades of scholarship on identity, race, gender, power, and belonging. Across multiple books, essays, and academic contributions, she has examined how systems shape not just opportunity, but inner life. How silence, compliance, and adaptation become survival strategies for marginalized communities. Tanya's work is grounded not only in theory, but in lived experience. She has spent career naming the psychological impact of exclusion, especially the kind that hides behind politeness, praise, and conditional acceptance. Her writing challenges the idea that assimilation is neutral or that belonging should require self-erasure. Rather than offering easy answers, Tanya asks the harder questions about voice, power, and the emotional cost of fitting in. Her courage is not a single moment or a provocative stance. It is a sustained choice to tell the truth across classrooms, communities, and pages, even when that truth disrupts comfort. This conversation is about the long arc of courage, how it forms, what it caused, and how it becomes a way of living rather than a single act. Tanya, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to chat with you. You and I have known each other for 15 years at this point.
Yes.
And
From our youthful days.
youthful days. We used to be young ones. And I was always so impressed with this sort of the quiet, steady power that you brought into the rooms and very thoughtful way of thinking about everything and then coming up with a solution and an answer when everyone else would be struggling to find a way forward. And that are some of my early memories of you. So I'm so excited to get into it. I was always curious about your background. So tell me about your initial days. Tell me about your family. How did you grow up? When did you grow up? Where did you grow up? What was your family like?
Thank you. That's very kind. All those things are very kind of you to say. And I'm very happy to be here. So thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. I grew up in San Diego. I am the youngest daughter of an interracial couple, parents who really were having an interracial relationship at a time that it was very unusual. So my parents met in 1960, and my dad is an immigrant from India. He had come to the US as a Fulbright scholar, and my mom was he was studying engineering at Columbia University, and my mom was an artist. She was a dancer, a modern and ballet dancer in New York, and they got set up on a blind date. And they were really challenging a lot of norms at the time. First of all, they were an interracial couple. Second of all, they actually dated for almost 10 years before they got married. Maybe even now is a little bit unusual. So they were on the older side for the time. Now it would be considered maybe normal age, but my mom was 34 when she got married, and she had my sister when she was 36. My dad was 45 when I was born. I'm 46 now, and I think, oh my God, if I had a newborn right now, what would I be doing, But they both had really Interesting and unique stories themselves. My dad had been the oldest son in a family that was born he was born in what's now Pakistan. He was 13 when partition happened. On my dad's side, my grandparents and my uncles and aunts, my aunt, um, had the experience of being political refugees and really having to experience, like, completely being displaced, their family being separated for some time while they managed the displacement, and then, migrating basically from what's now Pakistan to India. And that trauma, that like very deep trauma, really impacted my dad, my whole family, really. And I'd say even myself. It's like partition is something that sort of looms. It's always the impact of that major upheaval is something that foregrounded my whole upbringing. And with my mom was Jewish American, and in that way, she grew up in the LA area in the 1930s and 40s. She firsthand experienced McCarthyism. Her family, my grandfather, her dad was blacklisted. So these kinds of personal, but also very political, connecting to larger social issues and historical moments were very present in my life growing up and really shaped kind of how my parents raised us and how they themselves just coped.
That is such a complex background. So, how did you think about your identity growing up? Because your dad was Indian and your mom was Jewish, Russian. So, what did you think about your identity?
I mean, it's interesting. So I mean, now in the US, there's a very big, like, Indian American community, and it's not uncommon for people to send their kids to, like, Hindi classes or Indian dance classes or whatever. When my dad immigrated to the US, there were no Indian restaurants. He had to eat, like, grilled cheese for the first 6 months that he was
Yeah,
here 'cause, like, vegetarian food was,
the
not
thing.
very common. I think he was living off, like, cheese pizza and eggplant parmesan or something. So, the idea of that generation, I think, was assimilation, and also for my mom, she was raised really with the idea of assimilation. So, there was kind of this I don't wanna say there was a full encouragement to assimilate, but there was this tension about, when do you assimilate and when do you not? The thing that happened to Jews in World War II during the Holocaust in Europe was like, it didn't really matter how Jewish they felt they were, right? Like, if they were identified by others as Jewish, they were persecuted. That was something that my mom talked about a lot, really wanted us to know that, like, I guess what she wanted us to know was, like, whether you think you are X, Y, or Z, how other people perceive you matters, and so why not then just be who you are, right? Because
Okay, so she was the one who wanted to break the norms. I was sitting here thinking, she's going to say, then you need to assimilate so
no,
nobody.
no,
Okay.
because she really could see, right? It didn't
Right.
matter. You might as well just be your authentic self then.
Interesting. Okay.
And
Because
my
people
dad
will
was
perceive you based on their own biases, so why bother?
so just be your authentic self. I think in a way it's the saying, like, you can't control how other people see you, so why not then just define yourself? So my mom was a very outgoing, like,
Mm.
vivacious person. My dad was so introverted, so quiet, and so I feel like my dad was really rebellious in a very quiet way in his own terms. He didn't like it when I was rebellious, but
Right.
he himself,
Right.
right? I can only think what my grandparents were feeling when it was like he's moving away and like marrying a foreigner and all this stuff. So I think that he probably has some rebellious streak inside him too that he didn't necessarily advertise, but like was
You
definitely
got
there.
it. You
Yeah.
got it. Okay. I do want to talk about your dad a little bit because the story that you told me of how he got into the university, it was so amazing. So shout out
So
to your
amazing.
dad. So tell me about what happened. How did he get into the university and then became a Fulbright scholar to move to US when
Yes.
it was such a big deal?
So my dad was about 13 when partition happened. At that time, it was my dad, his 2 younger brothers and younger sister, and then my grandparents, and they moved first to Bombay or Mumbai, and then the family split just out of
Yeah.
necessity for survival. My dad and my aunt and my grandmother went to Benares. One of my uncles and my grandfather went to Nagpur, and then one stayed in Mumbai. And when they got to Benares, my dad was very or is, he's still with us. He's 92 now. He's incredibly smart. He's one of those guys that like is so smart he can't, do 2 things at one time. Anyway, so he had actually graduated high school at 13. But because of partition, like, there's no paperwork, no high school certificate, nothing. So, when they went to Benares, he just and I love this story because I just can't imagine this happening in today's context at all. This is, like, such a specific time and place. He went to the president of the university to his house at
Right.
breakfast, and the servant let him in, and the guy was there, like, having his breakfast, and he explained his situation. He was like, "Look, I'm a refugee. I graduated high school, but I don't have any paperwork or certificate or anything, but I really wanna start university." And the guy was very from my dad's story, the guy was very sympathetic to his
Mm.
situation and just said, "Okay, we'll admit you sort of provisionally for the 1st semester." And my dad said that he did so well that the rest of his time there, he got a full scholarship. And, as I was telling you before, he was involved in a lot of very exciting projects. He helped build the very first computer in India. He said was like many rooms big, because it was like these
Yeah.
big machines, right, at time in the late 50s and early 60s. And then he was able to apply for a Fulbright scholar, Columbia University. He was accepted, and then that's how he came to the US. And I
Mm.
don't know if his intention was to stay, but he ended up staying. I don't know if it was like go and then come back, or that's not clear to me, but he did end up staying. And then he helped bring each of my uncles and my aunt and my grandparents to the US. So he carried a big burden on his shoulders of being, the eldest in his family, the eldest son, the first to immigrate. He as we've talked about before, he was a very violent figure in my upbringing. There were times that I felt like he was a terrorist in the house. It was like wherever he was, I just wanted to not be there, right?
Right.
And he could be very physically violent, very verbally abusive. And now as an adult that as you get older, you start to see your parents as like adults, right? Or
Right.
as like full human beings. It's not that I excuse his behavior, but I think I understand where he was coming from and why he did what he did. And there's part of me that has compassion for him that, like, he didn't have the support, right, that he needed. He didn't have like, he experienced severe trauma and is of a generation that there is no such thing as, like, mental health, whatever, right? It's like, you just don't even talk about that stuff. So, you know, I can kinda see the bigger context of, like, why things turned out the way they did, and it makes me sad for me, but it also really makes me deeply sad for him and my family. It's like, these were conditions that were far outside their control and were really just about, like, bureaucrats saying drawing
Yes.
random lines on a map, and it wasn't until as an adult I actually started to learn about partition, like, as a historical event, like, unreal, the sort of chaos, trauma, violence that occurred in that historical moment. I can't even imagine what my dad saw or went through
Yeah.
that he hasn't. He's talked a little bit about his experience, but I can only imagine the things he's not sharing
Right.
because it's so horrific, and that was completely outside of his control.
I mean, it's so easy to forget all of these things shape us as human beings, and if you don't have a good model to emulate, you would become what your environment is. And
Yeah,
even now, people so conveniently forget that if they create a bad environment, that will reflect not in just their immediate surroundings, but it has reverberations across multiple generations.
yeah,
The impact that they
absolutely.
can't even imagine. Still not mindful of how we carry ourselves in society, knowing that fact, which I wish we would change as humans.
Yeah, I mean, it's so deep. And, even the same, like, on my mom's side, there's a similar theme, I guess you could say, in that my grandparents and great-grandparents on my mom's side ended up immigrating to the United States again out of sort of fleeing persecution
Oh,
as Jews in sort of like the Russia, Poland region. The borders were kinda constantly shifting, so it's unclear, like, if it was Russia or Poland at the moment, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism. Pogroms were a major issue at that time, just, like, mass terrorizing of Jewish communities and killing. So it was like, I think on both sides of my family, something that was very clear to me is how our personal lives, our individual lives are connected to these like larger structural issues of like power and
mhm.
domination and discrimination, or whether it's based on religion or caste or race or gender or whatever. Yes, we're experiencing these things at our personal individual level, but they're very deeply connected to larger social structures.
Right. And you started thinking about that at a very early age.
Yeah, I'm real after our last conversation, I was really thinking about, like, where did this come from? I don't know actually, but I
Right.
can, from the earliest of ages, really remember having a very strong sense of justice and
Mm.
fairness and
Yes.
being like this, observing things around me, just even in my family, feeling like this isn't right. I had to say something.
And how did that show up in the way you carried yourself as a teenager? How did you decide, when you were becoming your own person, the choices you made, I'm assuming there was a rebel in you as well, because that's in your genes. So, like, how did that show up as a teenager? How did you make your choices? Just tell me about, like, your psychology when you were growing up. What did you feel? Were you trying to, like, kind of do that assimilation thing and erasing who you were to fit in?
That's a really good question. I mean, it was sort of messy. It was
Yes.
messy, right? I think my kind of positionality of, like, coming from this multiracial background, having a big sort of Jewish influence also, and, being Jewish in America it's an interesting experience because everything is based on a Christian norm. It's like Christianity is even not religiously, but sort of ingrained secularly into life. So you are aware of yourself as a Jew from a very young age. I mean, I'll just speak for myself. You're aware of being other. I was aware of being other. I was aware of being not white, not Christian, not of a certain social class. Like, even though my dad had a good job, part of the kind of cycle of abuse was a lot of financial abuse, and so we grew up, like, very poor conditions. So that was also like, a very odd
Yes.
contradiction, and when you grow up when you are of a lower economic status, you
Right.
also are very aware of yourself as an outsider. So I was highly aware of myself as an outsider in a lot of different ways. Also, my sexual identity, I didn't have words necessarily for it at the time, but had a feeling that, like, just one of these things is not like the other, you know? So it was messy in that, like, my mom, as I said before, was, like, always really encouraging us
Mm.
to be ourselves, be authentic, be an individual, and yet you wanna just belong too, right? Like, you wanna feel welcome, you wanna feel like you belong to something. So I would say, yeah, it was messy and it was awkward and it was many different conflicting feelings at the same time. And that continued for me well into my early 20s. Like, I would say it wasn't until I went to graduate school that even college was, like, messy and complicated for
Mm.
me in the sense of, like, my development of myself or my own identity. I mean, I was starting to kind of
Yeah.
get exposed to feminist thinking as an undergrad, and that was very exciting and kind of was starting to articulate some ideas that I had already had. It was like I was finally starting to find the language for
Mhm.
things that I had already felt and
Right.
thought. So
Right.
that was very exciting, but it wasn't until I was in graduate school that things started to really, like, click for me, and I have to say that that was really where I felt like I connected with feminism, I connected with women's studies as an academic discipline, and that really helped me to, like, find myself in a lot of ways because it was, like, ways of thinking, perspectives on the world, language that described the world in a way that I could understand and I felt like reflected me to myself. It was, like, one of the first times I saw myself reflected back to me.
Oh, that is so interesting. Let's talk about that a little bit. So you chose to study women's studies, and for those who don't know what women's studies, because I hadn't heard of it until I
Yeah.
met you. So like, what is that? And what about the study sort of attracted you? Because you and I were talking about the dynamics of power when you were growing
Yes.
up, and you didn't have a voice to describe it or language to describe it, and women's
Yeah.
studies helped you do that. So
Yeah, so it's women's studies, gender studies, feminist studies, women gender sexuality studies. These are all kind of various names for the same sort of thing. It's an interdisciplinary field that I would say one of the key aspects of it is that it uses feminism as sort of a methodology, a theory, a way of theorizing about all different kinds of topics, right? So it studies, there are people who do all different kinds of research on all different kinds of topics, sort of imbued with a feminist lens. And it's also a very intersectional approach to understanding issues. So it looks at gender, but it also looks at things like race and class and citizenship status, ability, right? All of these different factors of like who we are that position us in society and then inform our relationship to various structures and other people. And I think it's also one thing that or I would say, like, 2 other things about it that really appeal to me. One is that it really puts the voices of people on the margins at the center of the question, and also it's really great at understanding and identifying how power is operating. So it's like seeing where power is, where it's not, how it's operating, how it's functioning, how it's being maintained, who has different kinds of power in what moments. I think that that is something that women's studies as a field really, I don't know, excited me about and also helped me to understand my place in the world, and to create new ways of thinking and new ways of being and validate those new ways of thinking and being beyond sort of the hegemonic norm, beyond the status quo. It's like we can imagine something else.
that's incredible.
So I find it very powerful and like I love teaching because it still is so powerful for students. Like, might be the first time being in a women's studies class might be the first time that a student has ever read a text
Mm.
that actually talks about them. You know what I mean? Like, about their experience and their life that they can relate to. And that's incredibly powerful and transformative.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. And you and I have talked about it. I've seen the same reflections in the corporate world, my experience of the world, growing up and fitting in India, fitting in the US, fitting in various jobs. And I feel like in my experience, just in myself and what I've seen others go through, other women go through, I would say specifically, and I see men do it as well sometimes, but then fitting in is such a big part of being a woman in workplace. And I finally got exhausted. So I decided I'm just going to do what, show up
Yeah.
as my authentic self. But younger women, I still see struggle with that. Like, where
Yeah.
is that line? Where and how much can we be ourselves? And where do we still continue to fit in? It is a topic of discussion in every conversation that I have with
Yeah.
young people that I mentor.
Yeah. And it's exhausting.
Oh, it is.
And it's exhausting for everyone. I mean, sort of these like white supremacists. There's this great feminist theorist named Bell Hooks. She talks about white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. It's like these systems are bad for everybody. They take a lot out of us. They demand more and more and more.
Yeah.
And it's unsustainable.
Yes. I mean, I just wish the world would be, there's so many people so intelligent. We have so much data to make better decisions and so much collective intelligence to make better decisions. And I just wish the world would be a different place and we would make better choices that are in benefit of everyone involved, not just a subset of
You.
people. So, yes, well, that's the hope. Okay,
Mm.
so let's go back to your school or your college days. Your dad, you told me your dad wanted you to become a doctor. So you did
Yes,
become a
of course.
doctor, a different kind of doctor.
The wrong kind of doctor. And
Technically, you did do what he asked
technically
you
I
to
did.
do.
Technically, the wrong
So,
kind.
what about in PhD? Getting a PhD is hard. Like it's a lot of.
Yeah.
What was your topic?
So,
Why?
so I was very interested in reproductive politics. I really found a very strong kind of interest or calling to issues of the body. I feel like the body is ground zero
Yes.
for power struggles. Who gets to make decisions about a person's body? What kind of value does a body hold? What shapes and sizes and configurations of bodies matter and which ones don't? So and the body is how we walk through the world or go through the world. So we have to be in our bodies. So how our body moves through the world or just exists is sort of, to me, like the most basic fundamental starting point for understanding ourselves in many ways. I also, in graduate school, was working at Planned Parenthood, just doing like very basic intake stuff, like taking patients' like names and phone numbers and blood pressure and temperature and stuff like that. But it was really interesting and also very, I guess, significant, like seeing that without that resource for a lot of folks, some folks that was their healthcare. So yeah, so I got really interested in issues of the body and reproduction, reproductive politics, and then for my master's degree, I did research with a non-governmental organization in India that was doing work with women who were HIV positive and were sex workers. And so I was doing work in outside Mumbai area in this red light district called Kamaripura, which is like, I think, one of the largest red light districts in the world. And, having these conversations with,
You were there physically
yeah,
in that
yes,
area.
in that area, yes.
Wow. Okay.
And doing workshops with women who were sex workers and who were HIV positive. And that was a very transformative experience for me. And I wanted to carry on that kind of work. So there was something that was interesting to me about like the colonial legacy of India and other places. I was sort of curious about like other places that also had this colonial legacy. And so after I did that project, I started to learn more about Ireland. Ireland also has this long like British colonial history, and it's a very different situation, but they had like this very kind of unusual at that time in the early 2000s. It was like they had been brought in to this globalized Europe. They were part of the Celtic Tiger, or they were the Celtic Tiger that was like this kind of economic engine after being on the margins of Europe for so long. And yet their reproductive politics were really entrenched in like, Catholicism, a strong sense of nationalism, and different things that didn't seem totally in rhythm with like where they were in terms of like their politics or economic ambitions, etc. I don't know if this is making sense, but it was just like very fascinating to me. It was very disjointed, and I was like, what's going on here? I decided to carry on my research, but looking at Ireland as a case study. So I did my PhD in Ireland at University College Dublin, and things didn't go the way I thought they were going to, but that's par for the course. It's just like it all kind of fell apart and then came back together again. It's a long story, and also I had a pretty significant mental health crisis because doing a PhD is
Oh my
really,
God, it's such a difficult topic. That's why I'm
and
sitting here with my mouth wide open going,
yeah, doing a PhD is really, it's really on its own, just really difficult.
hmm
It's very, I found it to be very isolating. It's incredibly stressful. All my own demons came out. So yeah, I had a pretty significant mental health crisis at that time as well. So like, yeah, so it all fell apart and then it all kind of came back together somehow. And yeah, and so then I just kept on writing and researching about all different kinds of reproductive justice issues. And my one of my more recent books, or I guess it came out maybe 2 years ago, was about adoption and foster care and reproductive justice because, fast forward to more recently, my partner and I, adopted our son through foster care, and it really, again, was, like, a very eye-opening experience of, like, the nuance and complicated and contradictoriness of our so-called child welfare system, and again, emphasizing this issue of, like, well, what families matter and what families don't, who's considered to be a legitimate parent and who's not, and does that translate into, like, resources and power and, like, who gets to have kids and who doesn't, or who gets to seen as legitimately having children or not, and how does the state then, like, invest in that? So or how does the state invest in, like, using family separation as a means to, like, terrorize certain communities in the United States? Or even that resonated very deeply with me in, like, my own family's history of being forcibly separated, partition. It's like these larger social structures and institutions impact, like, how families operate, connections that are made. It can be very traumatic. It is a tool of trauma. It is a tool of terror to, like, take children away from their families. I'm just thinking about, like, more recently in the United States, how they were, how families have been separated at the border. That has a very long impact on people's lives. It's, like, definitely a way of exerting power over.
There was a thought that came to mind. Yes, we haven't talked about it, your experience with foster care. What was that like, where you ended up writing an entire book about that experience?
The book is not about, like, my own personal experience. It's about I co-wrote it with my friend and colleague, Dr. Krista Benson, and we both had different experiences with the foster care system just in different ways, right? Like, I had this experience of sort of forming family through the foster care system. They had worked with youth who were in group homes, and so we both really saw the foster care system as, like, this non-neutral and actually in many ways harmful institution. And so we wanted to kind of articulate that using a reproductive justice framework. How do issues of adoption and foster care fit into this larger discussion around reproductive politics? And, so the beginning of the book starts out by tracing sort of the history of what we now call the child welfare system through things like family separation of enslaved people in the United States, Indian child removal, and the removing of, like, Native children from their families to Indian boarding schools, and connecting that with family separation in contemporary society, contemporary American society. And it's not that, and I just wanna, like, for listeners, kinda clarify, right? Like, in many cultures, there is a tradition of, like, communal child rearing, right? You might send your child to your sister to be raised or whatever. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about where, like, the state
Mm.
comes in and forcibly, involuntarily, separates
Yeah.
children from parents. So, yeah, and we talk about how, like, that connects to the juvenile justice system, and one of the things that I really love about that book is that we were able to break up our chapters with, we call them interludes, but they're, like, long free form interviews, sort of like what we're doing right now with, different scholars and activists and adoptees themselves, right? Because that's one of the things that was really important to us, is, like, neither of us are adoptees. So we really wanted to use our book as a way to highlight the voices of those adoptees who are talking about, writing about, theorizing about their own experience. So, yeah, so I'm really proud of that book because I think it provides, like, a really good framing for just understanding adoption and foster care as reproductive justice issues. right? Like a lot of times when people think about like reproductive rights or even reproductive justice, they think like abortion or birth control, which are absolutely like very important topics. But the point of reproductive justice is that like it's much broader than that. It's about all these other issues intertwining together that will really come down to like who has the right to have children, who has the right not to have children, like how can people parent the children that they already have in a safe and sustainable way, you know? And that speaks to a lot of different issues. It speaks to issues about the law, it speaks to issues about the environment, about economics, about racism, about ableism.
Can we talk about reproductive politics a little bit?
Sure.
You gave name to something that, and of course, the concept has existed forever, but you gave name to something that I thought about, I've had conversations about, I've been confused about. Like, I have been confused forever about why does everyone else gets to decide when women can have children or not have children, or about abortion, like that, the debate about abortion. I just have been always confused about the fact that the people who actually are supposed to do it, like the women that will decide for themselves, they're nowhere in the picture. Everyone else is having a
Yeah.
conversation about it. So
It's
just
so
tell me more
weird.
about this reproductive politics. How did it come about? Just kind of like a history so I can orient myself. And there are some women I have questions, and some people ask me this because I chose not to have kids. That's my
Mhm.
choice, right? And I'm glad I was able to make a choice. Of course, I had to kind of fight the system to make that choice for
Yeah.
myself. But I do get that question a lot as to how did I choose or how did I know? And then that question itself like tells me how much pressure society exerts on women to have kids. So, tell me more about like your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I guess getting back to what I was saying before about this idea that like the body is like there's this feminist phrase, I think it's based on a piece of art. I don't have the name of the person off the top of my head that did this art, but it's a piece of art that's called "The Body is a Battleground."
Oh, okay.
And I love that phrase because the body actually is this site, physical site, where all of these arguments over values and ideology get played out. So, decisions about or like yeah, decisions or rules or regulations about the body are not about the rules and regulations themselves. They are about something else, you know? Like if you think about the abortion debate in the United States, for example, it's not logical that the same folks who are trying to regulate and ban abortion are the same folks who don't want to give free school lunch, you know? It's like, it's not about what they say it's about. It's about something else. It's really about controlling not just women's bodies, but like certain women's bodies for certain purposes. It gets back to issues of like, who do we want reproducing? Who do we not want reproducing? How can we make conditions that force or are conducive to encouraging certain groups of people to reproduce and other groups of people not to reproduce? Here's a maybe to make it more concrete, here's a good historical example. Prior to Roe v. Wade in, the early 1970s, which was like a landmark abortion case in the United States, you had this situation where women of color were being coercively sterilized by the hundreds of thousands, and white women were struggling to be able to access abortion or birth control. So, like, what? Like, how do you make sense of that, right? The only way to make sense of that, it can't be about whatever the mainstream thinking is about, like, the value of life or about protecting children, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to square the circle of, like, these contradictory
Interesting.
policies.
I hadn't thought about it that way.
So reproductive politics for me is about like issues of bodily integrity, of bodily autonomy, who gets to make decisions about their body, who's seen as legitimate decision makers, like who do we think is trustworthy enough to make decisions about their bodies. And this breaks down by race, but it also breaks down by gender, it breaks down by class, it breaks down by citizenship status or ability.
Okay, let's keep stacking that. As in, let's keep stacking what a woman has to go through in her life. So we started off with first kind of coming up with an identity of your own, figuring out how to be authentic, but, within the norm of like fitting in. You can't fit in too much. You have to stand out a little bit. So we're starting there, then making choices of what do we study, when do we study, where do we study, then making choices of how do we show up in the corporate world or in the social world. Then we talked about having this kind of weight of expectation, especially in our culture. It's changing a little bit, but in Indian culture, as an example, the weight of expectation that I grew up with, getting married at a decent time,
Yeah, absolutely.
having kids.
Yeah,
And now, let's talk about that. The point that you and I were discussing now, I have seen that a lot of women are the primary breadwinners
yeah,
or earners in their families, and they still have to have kids, and they still have to do a
yes,
very good job at their job because they are getting the healthcare, they are getting the money for their families. But men are very nice, they're taking care of kids, but then they can't have kids if they choose to. Women can go earn if they choose to. Now, there is like double role, double duty we have to
yeah.
do.
Yeah, so I just wanna back up for, like, 1
Mm,
second to talk about this idea of choice, right? Because one of the things too about reproductive justice, I think is very important is to really, like, look closely at this word choice and kinda think about, like, what are all the things that you need in order to make a choice, right? And there's so many things that you need to be able to make a choice. Laws that allow you to carry out the choice that you want, like, you need to be able to make your choice not put you in jail. You need to have financial resources to make your choice possible.
mm,
You need to live in an environment that's free of violence or coercion. I think in a lot of places around the world, it's not the woman herself who decides the number and spacing of her children. It might be her mother-in-law or, somebody else, the husband or whatever, right? So or social pressure, like we've seen, I mean, in India, this is a very big problem, sex selective abortion, right?
mm,
So it's
mm.
like, even you wanna have children, okay, so girls, boys, like, are you gonna terminate once you find out that the fetus is female? Like, all of these things are surrounding this idea of choice. So there's, these great feminist scholars, Sonia Crea and Rosalind Chachesky, who talk about this idea of enabling conditions, like, you need power and resources to actually make a choice. So what are the enabling conditions? What are all the things that you need that will, like, enable the choice that you wanna make? And so even with, like, the current situation when we talk about, like, women who are choosing to work and have a family or whatever, like, I just want us to really think, or I encourage my students, I guess I could say too, to, like, really think a little bit about, well, what does that actually like, what is the context surrounding this choice? Like, are they really able to make the choice that they wanna make about their body? Considering economic factors, social pressures, cultural expectations, religious standards, or even, fear,
Yeah,
again, violence or
yeah.
coercion or retribution from government bodies.
Social retribution.
Retri-
Sometimes it's not government bodies, sometimes it's your own families.
So it's complex, and I think that, women are I talk about this with my students a lot. It's like women sense of what's possible has changed a lot over the last 50 years. Gender roles in many ways have changed a lot over the
Mm.
last 50 years for women, but for men, it hasn't been as fast moving. There's still this deep misogyny that really devalues those attributes associated with women. So, like, nurturing, all of that. It's like that's still really devalued. So whereas women maybe are stepping more into what's been historically, like, masculine or dominated or men dominated spheres, men are not stepping into women dominated spheres at the same rate
Yeah.
because it's still seen as sub value. And so women are still expected to do that double, what's called the double day or second shift. It's like, okay, you go to work and then you come home and you go to work again, like, taking care of the kids, and or even the mental load of, like, keeping track of the appointments and doctor's visits and whatever. It's like that also is work. Even if you're hiring someone else to do that for you,
You're managing them.
you're managing them. And let's, like, think about that relationship, right? It's like, in order to manage my own gendered expectations as sort of like an upper class woman, I'm drawing on the devalued labor of another more marginal woman. Like, that's not That's not justice. That's not equity. Yeah, so, like, even in our day-to-day life, I often think of ask my students to think of, like, "Okay, do you wanna get married someday? Do you wanna have kids? Like, if so, who's gonna like, have you thought about how that's actually gonna work? What negotiations are you gonna make? What kind of conversations are you gonna have with your partner? On your own, what kind of supports do you need?" Right? Because the idea, the fantasy is so ever present.
And you have given a really good idea, which is this choice framework. And I think every woman needs that for every aspect of their life. How do you choose to take a job that will actually help support your life and not take away from it? Well, that's a complicated issue now, especially in tech. But how do you choose to date someone? That is a question that I get a lot. How do you choose to have kids or not? How do you? So, what is? Let's talk about the choice framework. How would you create that type of framework that somebody can benefit from?
Yeah, so I think what a lot of feminist scholars and activists are really trying to move towards is or move away from notions of choice and move more towards notions of, like, justice or rights. So, in terms of, like, the reproductive justice movement, there's a lot of focus on, like, human thinking of this as, like, a human rights issue, right? Like, how can we create a world that is more just and equitable, that values, like, human values human life. It's in its many different expressions, in its variety of expressions, and moving away from, like, the market to decide or, sort of capitalist conceptualizations of value and something different. Because so much of the idea of choice is really embedded in the idea like, well, if you can afford to make the choice, then you should be able to make the choice. But that's like such an oversimplified, not only oversimplified, but it like totally makes invisible the power structures of how certain people got to be in positions of choice making and others didn't, right? Because there's exploitation involved there. It's like,
But what can we do in our daily lives to be able to choose better for ourselves?
yeah, I mean, I think at the individual level, well, first of all, it's not only an individual issue, right? So that's like there are things that we can do, I think, at the individual level, but I think more importantly, we have to think of it like collectively and think of ourselves in community with others and form that connection and community.
And I think in a way you're already living that, right? Like you've taken all the trauma, the complexity, the decades and decades of angst and every other emotion that's associated with trauma, and you've turned it into something really beautiful. You've given it voice. You are actually, by your actions, making it normalized for women to make those choices for themselves. And I think that's at least one of the ways where, and you tell me what you think about it, but at least in my experience, that's one of the ways that I feel we can help inform these choices by making them yourself and making it
Yeah.
normal for women to make those choices.
I think also like being as authentic as we can be. There's a lot of both imagined and real barriers to
Yeah.
being authentically ourselves, but to whatever extent we can. And then also one place to just really easy place to start is through dialogue with others and really opening ourselves to others' experiences and listening and then sharing our experience because that's one way to sort of complicate our understanding or our point of view of like what these issues are, how they're playing out. I certainly do not have the solution to these, definitely not.
Well, you're
But I
trying.
but I think that a place to start by having curiosity and by sharing
Yeah.
our own stories.
Yes. And that's exactly why I'm doing this.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Okay, let's turn it back to your life. So, a couple of other questions that I was thinking about, when we were having that conversation was you're talking about things that are quite controversial. So, has there been a time in your life when publishing or teaching a certain material exposed you to a professional risk or a personal risk? Did it test your commitment? What type of courage did you have to tap into?
This is something I've actually really been thinking about a lot lately because our current political climate is such that there's a little bit more of a green light than there has been before on openly being discriminatory or even intimidating or harassing
Mm-hmm.
people that you don't, you know, agree
Mm-hmm.
with their views. For academics in particular, like, across the country, there's been really a, very overt silencing, of I'll just say, like, in terms of gender and sexuality, people who are doing work around those issues, like, there's been a real, like, real shift in defunding grants, projects, funding sources for people who are doing research on gender and sexuality. Last year, the Trump administration issued an executive order about, gender ideology. I encourage people to just Google it. It's kind of a trip. So there are real consequences right now for people who are speaking and talking and researching about issues having to do with gender, race, sexual identity, any kind of quote unquote diversity issues. I work at a public institution. My office is, you can Google it and find out my office and all of that, right? So I've really had to think about, like, how do I want to navigate this moment? And I think a lot about, what I started out talking about my mom and Holocaust. Jews were being rounded up regardless of whether they were, like, practicing Jews or not. So, is it better to not speak and be afraid, or is it better to speak and be afraid? It's like, I think for me, it's better to speak because you're gonna be afraid anyway, right? And also, what am I living for? What am I using my life for? What is the purpose of being here if not to be here fully
And make a meaningful difference.
and make a meaningful difference?
Exactly. Exactly. That's deep. Oh my goodness. You're living
So
with that every day.
it is deep. It is deep, and it's been like sort of an existential crisis a little bit that
Yeah.
made me kind of work through it because it feels very real at the moment. But it's like, the fear will be there regardless. So speak.
And on that note, you have a new book coming up.
Yeah, so my new book, it's co-written with, my colleague, Grace Howard. It's called Abortion: What Do We Know and What Should We Do About It? It's, a
Mhm.
series from Sage Publications, and it traces, it kinda gives abortion some context, some historical context, and argues that we need to see it as a human rights issue, why it's such an important issue of bodily autonomy and integrity that folks have access to abortion worldwide. So, I mean, it's covering a lot of things in in a very short amount of pages respectively, but I think it's meant to really be sort of like a primer or a first introduction to that topic of, like, why abortion is an important issue and to understand it as a human rights issue in
Okay.
a nutshell, in
Yeah.
a nutshell.
All right. Well, that was a lot.
It was a lot.
Thank you for digging into all of that. I mean, I knew you, but now just talking to you, even in the last hour, there is so much more that I've learned about you. And I feel like there are so many more discussions we're going to have. Just that experience of being in the red light district physically, like I still
Yeah.
can't imagine it. I watch movies and I get impacted. I can't stop crying. And, that kind of made me question. Just the movies make me question about the role of women and just how we're devalued essentially. And then you kind of having lived that and then you decide to do a PhD on this subject. Oh my goodness, like there is so much. I mean, you talk about courage. I built this podcast, The Courage Curve, to kind of share the stories, but you are choosing courage at an exponential level on a daily basis. Like it's amazing the life that you've lived and the change you're trying to create. So thank you so much for sharing that. My last question for you. For someone that's listening that grew up carrying this history and expectation that they didn't choose, what do you want them to know that they're not imagining? And how do you want them, or how do you suggest they choose courage over anything else?
I think I would want every person in that situation to just really discover
Mm.
their own story. Like, there's nothing more powerful than our own story, and it allows us to really connect with other people. And even if somebody else hasn't gone through exactly what we've gone through sharing our story, we can form empathy and compassion and connection, which is really, like, maybe the building blocks of our humanity. And I think, like, the battle between courage and faith in ourselves and fear and doubt, it's like it's a moment to moment battle. It's a moment to moment battle. And so it's like, to whatever extent we can in that moment, sort of choosing to head in the direction of courage and faith rather than fear and doubt. And then knowing too, like, you fall 9 times, get up 10. It's like, it's okay. It's okay, like, to fall down and then get back up.
And find somebody that can help you get back up,
And
which is
yeah,
why we're doing this.
exactly. And rely on those around you
Yeah.
because we're in it. We really are in it together.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for sharing your story. And I feel so encouraged and just excited to continue this conversation with you in months and years to come and helping contribute to your work in some way. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you so
joining me today.
much.
Thank you for listening to The Courage Curve. I hope this conversation offered you perspective, comfort, and a sense of companionship as you move through your own moment of change, especially if you're choosing courage before clarity. And remember, women rise best when we rise together. Follow the show and share it with someone who may need it.